welcome to Leading the Way for You, a webinar series hosted by Country Meadows Retirement Communities and our sister company, Ecumenical Retirement Community. In this series, we will host our senior care experts who will share information on a variety of topics that interest you. My name is Kelly Kuntz, and I'm coming to you from one of our apartments at our retirement community. Today, we're going to be joined by the Reverend Howard West, Executive Director of Spiritual Life and a trained counselor. He will share information and insights for you to lean on and use your religious or spiritual beliefs during your journey caring for a loved one with Alzheimer's or related dementia. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce the Reverend Howard West.
Well, as Kelly just said, today I'm going to be talking about caregiver self-care through the lens of spirituality. And many experts and people that write about spirituality say that the best way to understand it is through story. So I want to start off with a story that comes from an ancient Chinese proverb. There once was a frog that lived at the bottom of a well, and he thought that was all there was in the world. And one day a bird accidentally flew down the well, and while he was down there, he talked to the frog, and he told him, "Did you know there's a big, wide world outside of this well?" The frog looked up and saw the light at the top of the well, and then he smirked and said to the bird, "No, I don't believe that." And the bird flew away, and the frog was stuck in the well. Now, that's sort of a depressing story. And actually, the Chinese version, "jingdi zhihua," is a phrase that's used in China and Taiwan today to explain a situation when someone gets so stuck in a situation they can't see the bigger picture. And that's, of course, what that metaphor is about, is that we get stuck in the well of life's pain and suffering. And sometimes even when people say there's a way out, we have trouble finding that. And I'm using that as an introduction because spirituality, the lens of spirituality, is an important way that we can gain a new perspective in the way we are dealing with the stress and the challenges of being a caregiver. Now, before I get into what's causing the stress and the difficult situation that caregivers find themselves in, I want to differentiate between spirituality and religion. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion about that. I think most of you know what religion is. I'm religiously ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and religion is an institution. It's a system of beliefs and traditions. One of the main focuses of religion is to keep people on track with a certain way of thinking or behaving. Now, spirituality is a much broader way of understanding what we believe in. Spirituality tends to be individualized. It tends to be more unstructured. It's more about a person finding their own meaning and their own belief, not trying to conform to something that some group or denomination is telling them to be or to believe. And spirituality also tends to be very centered around relationships and connectivity, connecting to people. So as we look through this lens of spirituality today, I'll be focusing on some of those elements, finding the own meaning from your own perspective, relationships, and being on a journey through your life's experiences. Now, one of the things that people tell me is they say, "Well, I'm not very religious, but I'm spiritual." And other people say, "Well, I'm not very spiritual, but I'm religious." And the fact is that there's a mixture in between all of those. And some of you out there may be religious and have your own spirituality. That's fantastic. Others of you, and this is one of the downfalls of religion, may have had a bad experience with the religion that you grew up with. But that doesn't mean that you can't still find spirituality in your life. We're always growing. We're always exploring. And then some of you listening may be agnostic. You're not sure what you believe. And some of you may even be an atheist. The point of all this is we're trying to use this lens of spirituality to reframe our experience, like that frog in the well, to look at things from a different perspective. Now, what are some of the benefits of taking a spiritual lens to deal with the stresses of being a caregiver? When you're a caregiver, it really takes a toll on your whole being. your physical being, your psychological being, your social identity, and your spiritual identity. So before I get to the spiritual burdens, I mean, let's remember that when you are physically and emotionally and socially worn out and compromised, that will affect your spirituality and your sense of a connectedness to a higher power or God. I mean, think about it. As a caregiver, you're dealing with fatigue and worrying about risks of falls and accidents. I mean, there might even be issues about your high blood pressure and the stress-inducing health issues. And then, of course, there's all the psychological challenges you deal with, like burnout, anxiety, lots of anxiety, mental fatigue, confusion from lack of sleep, and then there's the risk of substance abuse or getting on the bandwagon with medications with doctors and getting lost and down that rabbit hole. And then, of course, from a social level, and this is a really big one, is that being a caregiver, especially if the person you're caring for is very needy, it can be very isolating, and you can feel abandoned by your family members. And it can also create a lot of tension with family members, because oftentimes people who aren't there living with the person you're caring for don't understand what you're going through. And as they're dealing with denial in their life, they may not be very supportive. Now, what are some of the spiritual burdens or challenges of caregiving? Well, one of them, and you may not have thought of this, is it's easy to have a loss of meaning and purpose in your life when your life is dominated with caregiving. And that really is a spiritual matter. As I said earlier, a big part of spirituality is reflecting on the meaning of life and reframing your experience so that you can understand it from a different perspective. The other thing that's really big is there's a lot of suffering that you're encountering as a caregiver. A lot of, maybe you would call, injustice. Why is this happening to my family member? Why am I stuck in this situation? So a lot of people that are in caregiver positions go through a faith identity crisis of sorts, where they're wondering, why is God letting this happen to me right now? Or another problem is maybe when you go to people at your church or your religious group, they don't give you sympathy or support, and you feel angry at the religious organization. So those are some of the challenges we're dealing with. What are some of the benefits of taking a spiritual approach or a spiritual lens? Well, one of the things is that if you make a commitment to working on your spiritual life, it can help you slow down and reflect and think about what's going on. Now, as Kelly said, I was a therapist, counselor before I became a minister, and my job was helping people reflect on things. And you don't have to just be in therapy to deal with that. You can do that with friends, family members, or maybe if you know clergy, to sit down and talk about what's going on in your life and think about the meaning of it and what the purpose of your life is. You can also use it as an opportunity to reframe the way you're looking at it. I have some tips in a minute I'll talk about that deal with reframing. And also, this is a big one here. The concept of powerlessness and acceptance are big in spirituality. There's some things in your life as a caregiver that you are powerless over. You can't just wish that your mother or father or husband or spouse would go away. You have to live with this person, and to some extent, you're powerless over that. By accepting that and reframing it from a spiritual perspective, you can start to differentiate what you have control over and what you don't have control over. And if any of you already know it, some of you may not, the Serenity Prayer. You've probably heard that. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That prayer is about accepting what we can change and what we can't. And it's usually more of our own attitude and the way we look at things than it is the other person. And then the other way that spirituality can help is developing a spiritual support network. It may not be your church community, but people who have empathy and are willing to talk about these deeper issues with you and show you love and concern. Now, I want to take a detour now and talk about loss and grief. Now, this is really important. Now, I don't know how many of you have thought about this, but when you're dealing with age-related illnesses and losses and dementia, memory impairment, Alzheimer's, there are a lot of losses. And I have to put a footnote in here right now, too, as we're living in a pandemic and we're all dealing with losses as a society because of many losses of activities and social connections because of the pandemic. Now, when we're aging, anyone is aging, we have losses, whether you're a person, the caregiver, or the person who's being cared for. As we age, we lose our quality of health over time. We lose our professional role. Oftentimes there's loss of relationships as friends that age pass away. We also have problems with what we call secondary losses, loss of independence, loss of your role as a productive person. And these two are really big as a caregiver, because when you're caregiving, think of how much independence you have to give up as you make a commitment to care for someone. And then this loss of being a productive individual, well, maybe you're caregiving for someone and that is being productive, but sometimes our society doesn't value the role of a caregiver, just like we tend to underestimate the role of a stay-at-home mom or father or parent. And then there's other issues, as I mentioned earlier, the loss of social connectedness, isolation that comes out of your time and schedule being dominated by a caregiver. And then finally, one of the biggest losses is a loss of self-esteem. Is when we lose these relationships and activities, they are mirrors that show who we are as a person. When we engage in a hobby or a fun activity with a friend and we enjoy that, we feel who we really are as a person. And as we become isolated, like that frog in the well, we forget all these dimensions of who we are as a person. And what happens is we begin to have a loss of self-esteem. So we have all these losses. And with loss goes grief. And I want to go over the grieving process because the elements of grieving really have a big impact on how you're dealing with the situation. And of course, many of you maybe know the Kubler-Ross 5 dimensions. I don't like to call them stages because they don't always happen in any order. 5 dimensions of grieving. There's denial, anger, bargaining. I like to call that guilt, depression or sadness, and acceptance. Now, because we have a limited amount of time, I won't get into the whole model and how we work through that, but you can't go around grief. You have to go through it. These emotional roller coaster rides of denial, anger, sadness, guilt, acceptance, we have to go through that to get through to the other side of being healed and having a healthier life. The big dimensions that I see people getting stuck in as they're going through grieving are denial. Denial looks like, oh, my mother isn't as bad as, I think, people say she is, okay? Or, well, we don't really need to deal with her driving right now. I think she's fine. Anger, okay? I can't believe this is happening to me. I spent my whole life planning to enjoy this time in my life, and all I do is take care of my mother or father. And then guilt. I really want to look at guilt here. When I do talks at different support groups, and I've been doing this for about a dozen years, the big topic that often comes up is guilt. Why do I feel so guilty all the time? And I'll say, well, what do you feel guilty about? And they say, well, I feel guilty that I'm not doing the right thing. I'm not being a good caregiver, okay? Or I feel guilty when I take care of myself. Everyone's saying, go take care of yourself, go out to dinner or go for a walk, and I can't enjoy myself because I'm feeling guilty. Guilt is a big problem that we see in a lot of caregivers. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. I think we have a question about that. And then the sadness piece. There's a fine line between sadness and depression. And I just want to encourage everyone to remember 2 things. It's normal to feel a lot of sadness and blues when you're dealing with a difficult situation. That doesn't necessarily mean you're clinically depressed, right? It's normal to feel sad. However, it never hurts to check in with a physician or a therapist or a doctor if that sadness is preventing you from getting out of bed, from eating, from taking care of yourself. So, we need to keep an eye on sadness. And if it goes a little over the line to depression, that's a clinical condition that can be treated successfully. So these are some of the components that we deal with. Now, I know the talk's about looking at caregiver self-care through a spiritual lens. And you're saying, well, this is psychology. Well, it's all tied together. And I wanted to give you a little bit of trivia. The word psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, P-S-U-C-H-E, psyche. And psyche in Greek means soul. So really, the soul and the psychology go together. So that's a little bit about grief. Now, let me get into some tips for self-care that I've used over the years. Okay, and this is again about reframing. I just mentioned that in psychology comes from the word psyche, and in the ancient world, they believed that we had a body, we had a mind. In Greek, it was called the nous, right, our intellectual mind, and then we had the psyche, the soul. What's happened in the Western modern world is sometimes we forget that our mind and our soul are two parts of us. And we look at the mind and we forget the soul or the spirit of the person. And I want to encourage all of you, I don't know what your theological or religious background is, but if you have a background where you believe a person has a soul, you need to differentiate between the person's mind and their soul. Ask yourself, am I confusing the person's mind? The mind may be really not functioning very well, but the soul is still in there and intact. And all of the great world religions believe that. And I've found in my work and in people I've worked with that if you remember the soul of the individual and that connection, that can help you not minimize the value of the person and make a more meaningful interaction with you and give you a more meaningful interaction with the person when you think I'm connecting with their soul. Another thing is, here's another spiritual tip. Like that frog in the well, he never got out of the well with the bird to see the bigger picture. We need to step back and look at the big picture. This ties in with meaning and purpose. When you look at the person you're caregiving for, remember their whole life, the past, not just the present. Because what happens is when we're in caregiving now with the person in the present, we think of them just as that person who's struggling or impaired. If we go back and we look at their whole life, the things they did as a mother, as a father, as a teacher, as a lawyer, as someone who was a grandparent to our kids before they had their troubles, we will see that the person is much bigger than the one we see today. And we need to ask, am I making an effort to remember the value of the whole person? Who do they love? What did they accomplish? What did they sacrifice? Now, why is that good for you as a caregiver? Because if you can see that person with greater meaning and value from the bigger picture, it's going to give you more hope that you're dealing with the person and loving them because they've given something to you and you're giving back to them, and that they are more than just a person that needs help. The next tip I want to look at is about how you're tying in with your religious or spiritual beliefs. Now, why do we need religion and spiritual beliefs? Well, one thing I had to learn when I transitioned from being a counselor and a therapist to being a minister is that psychology and religion answer different questions. Psychology tends to answer questions that have answers based in science. And religion and spirituality answer questions that can't be answered by science. For example, why is there suffering in the world? Okay, there's another example. What's the meaning of my life? Science can't answer that question. How can compassion make me a better person during a difficult time? So when we look at spirituality and religion, I want to encourage all of you to look for resources to deal with those tough questions. How am I dealing with suffering? How am I dealing with death? A huge part of my ministry has been dealing with end-of-life care, death, and dying. And there's a lot of resources on hospice websites and palliative care websites that will help you deal with looking for meaning and purpose when you're dealing with someone who's drawing to the end of their life. And for people with these dementia-related illnesses, it's often not a quick death. It can be a slow and unpredictable death. And having those spiritual beliefs about what the end of life process is and what happens after you die can be a very important way for you to deal with those challenges. The other thing I want to say is this, is we're not qualified to take care of other people unless we take care of ourselves. If you don't take care of yourself and you get burnt out and you get frustrated, that's going to affect the quality of care you give someone. So taking care of yourself is not only a responsibility to yourself, it's a responsibility to the people who are under your care. So I want to encourage you to take time to recharge your batteries, to find things that you enjoy in life, to spend time with people away from the caregiver that enrich you, and not just look for religious and spiritual affairs, but nature. Nature is a big thing. I found nature, and I have a story here at the end about nature that illustrates that. But anything that allows you to get a break from the caregiving and recharge your batteries, that's spiritual self-care. So I'd like to close with another story, and this is actually from my personal life. About 2 years ago, my wife's sister was dying of metastatic cancer, and we went to visit them at Christmas on Eastern Long Island. And her husband was very, very depressed. He was one of the caregivers. And one of my hobbies is I do wildlife and bird photography, and my wife said, you know, he needs to get out of the house. So I took my brother-in-law and I said, hey, let's go for a walk at the beach. And he was like, oh, okay, whatever. I said, I think that's going to help you. So we went down to the beach on the southern shore of Long Island, and we were walking along, and we walked over some sand dunes. And as we came around the corner, we saw the snowy owl. And it was like, you want to talk about a spiritual moment. He looked at that, and he looked at me, and he said, are you seeing that? And I said, yeah. And he said, I've never seen one of those. I never thought I'd see one of those in my entire life. And he said, because he knows I'm a minister, he said, do you think that's a coincidence? I said, no, I don't think it's a coincidence. I do a lot of bird watching, and I've hardly ever seen one of those. And he said, you know, I needed something like this right now, and this helped me. I think maybe God sent this because he knew I needed some help. And I said, yeah, I believe that, sure. And I said, and I'm an expert. I can validate that as a minister. And we went home, and when they looked at my brother-in-law, they said, what did you do with him? I said, I didn't do anything. We went out and we experienced life, and life put something beautiful in his path that he didn't expect, and it lifted him out of that depression that he was in. And that frog got out of the well that day. That's a story I want you to remember, is that you need to make moments for yourself to get a break and get out in life, and let life put things in your path to recharge your batteries and to renew your spirit. And with that, I'd just like to close. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Howard. That's a lot of great tips to help people along the way. We've received several questions in advance of your presentation from some folks. First of all, we'll start with Angela. Very basic question, but very powerful question. Do other people who are caregivers feel this overwhelmed with anger, resentment, depression, and burnout? She feels like she's the only one experiencing these emotions.
Great question. And that's one of the reasons why we emphasize that you connect with other people in the same position. Because as a therapist, one of the main goals I had when I worked with clients was to help them do what's called normalizing an experience. And what you've just described are normal, typical reactions of people that are in a difficult caregiving position. But the problem is this: if you don't talk to other people in the same boat, you'll think it's abnormal. You'll think there's something wrong. But I can tell you, because I have a tremendous amount of experience, that all of those things are common among caregivers. That's why we're doing this webinar right now, because I'm hoping that we're going to get this message out there that, yeah, it's hard, you're not alone, and you shouldn't feel guilty about it. See, there's that guilt thing I talked about earlier. One of the reasons why we struggle with guilt is if we don't have the information to understand what we're going through, we beat ourselves up, right? And that's related to the grief thing too, is we get stuck in that, well, couldn't I do this some other way? Couldn't I be a better caregiver? Why should I feel guilty because I feel this way? But when you talk to other people or someone like me or people that deal with it and find out, no, that's normal. You just need to feel it and ride it out with support, and it's going to be okay.
We have one here from Grace that I feel like I could have written this question as well as a caregiver. She asks, some of my family members just don't understand how hard it is for me to care for my loved one. How can I get them to understand the situation and what I'm going through? I don't mean to be selfish, but help my family members understand how difficult caregiving can be.
That is an extremely common problem among a lot of families, especially today when a lot of family members don't live nearby. You may have, say you're the caregiver and you're living nearby or living with the person you're caregiving for, and then the other people live in other states. There's two levels to this, to the answer to this question. One is, this can be a problem that's just annoying or frustrating. The second level is there may be legal decisions or medical or care decisions that have to be made, and you need to be on board to make an important decision. On the first level, if it's just a frustration and it's making your life harder, but those people don't need to be part of any decisions or planning, the answer is you're going to have to set some boundaries with them about how you deal with them. And in some cases, and I've seen this in a number of families, you may need to consider limiting the communication or contact with them if they just don't get it. Because I have to tell you this. Remember, one of the elements of the grieving process is denial, and there's a high degree of denial in family members dealing with dementia-related illnesses, especially when they don't live nearby. They're not seeing the day-to-day experiences. So setting a boundary with those folks and saying, look, I have to accept that maybe they don't understand what it's really like, and maybe I can't change their mind, so I'm going to limit my communication with them. Or say I'm not going to talk about those particular topics we disagree about. Now, the other level is when there's an important decision or you need to work together and you can't avoid working through this difference of opinion and the denial. And my advice on that would be to do two things. One is to try to have the person come and spend as much time with the person you're caring for so they can get the experience. They need the experience to experience firsthand what the person is like and what their functioning is like. You can't persuade people out of this with an intellectual argument. They need to experience it directly. The other thing is maybe include them in a medical visit with a doctor or a social worker and engage them in the process of understanding what's going on. And the more information they have, the better they're going to be able to accept what you're dealing with and get on the same page. And I think I saw Maureen Sirianni, my colleague, talked about that in her presentations about the more you know about this illness, the more power you have and the more freedom you have to deal with it. So think of it more as empowering and helping give people a new freedom to deal with it than that you're right and they're wrong. They're trying to deal with it too. They just maybe don't have enough information. And some won't ever accept it. That's possible too. And in that case, you need to turn to people that do understand. And it may be people outside your family.
Your advice is great to try to limit your interaction with those family members who caused you frustration as the caregiver. But sometimes that's not easy to do. Any practical tips beyond what you've already shared to maybe help diffuse those feelings of anger and frustration that the caregiver is experiencing with that outside family member.
That is difficult, and I think there's two levels that you have to work on with that. One is you're going to need to have some friends or family members that are supporting you as you try to deal with those conflicts. If it's if we use a military metaphor, if you look at some of these special forces guys that they send into difficult situations, you don't realize that behind them there's this huge support team of people in communications and logistics. And when we're on the front line with caregivers and we're having conflicts with other family members, we need cheerleaders that can say, yes, stick to your guns. And, I agree with you. You shouldn't talk to your brother too much. He just upsets you. So you need a cheerleading squad. But then the other element is you need someone you can vent with. And these people and families that don't understand what you're going through, they're the worst people to try to vent to, because they're going to do two things. They're not going to want to hear your feelings because it's going to bother them. And they may actually want to give you really bad advice and try to fix you. And this ties in with support. Is the best support you can get as a friend or family member that can do two things. Listen to you, okay? And here's the key, not give you advice, okay? Most people don't need advice. They just need someone to listen to them. And as a man, I have to admit, and my wife of almost 30 years reminds me of this, that men tend to be fixers. We don't like to listen. As soon as we hear something, we want to fix it. So for women out there, sometimes it's better to find another woman who will just listen, because the men tend to fix. And you don't really need to be fixed. You just need to be validated and listened to so that you can process everything and get some confidence in what you're doing to go forward.
At our Country Meadows locations, as well as Ecumenical Retirement Community, many of them host support groups with the Alzheimer's Association, or just gatherings for family members to come together and share their experiences and just have someone to talk to. And if we don't host those support groups, we can certainly share some resources and locations where you can go to find that support. Are the support groups yet another good tool to deal with this guilt of coping with your own emotions around caregiving and other family members or challenges that you are experiencing?
I cannot emphasize enough how important support groups are. To use an analogy, we talk about some foods are superfoods. If you eat a certain type of a food, you get like 5 or 6 different types of nutrients. And support groups are kind of a spiritual superfood. You get so many things when you go to a support group. And I've attended, countless Alzheimer's support groups at Country Meadows. And I'm going to go down that list I gave earlier about ways that spirituality helps you deal with the situation, because you can find pretty much all of those in a support group. Support groups will help provide you a way to slow down and reflect about what's going on. It's sometimes hard to reflect on things when you're all by yourself and lonely, but when you're in a support group and you listen to other people talk, you may not even share, but by listening to other people that are going through the same experience, that creates a reflection opportunity to think about what's going on. Support groups also give you a way to reframe your situation. I've seen people come into the Alzheimer's support groups and they feel like it's a completely hopeless situation. And then somebody shares how they already dealt with that 5 years ago. And instantly they realize, wow, it isn't hopeless. Other people have dealt with it, and I guess I can too. So it helps reframe and give you a positive outlook. And then we talked about exploring purpose and meaning. When you go to a support group and you hear the story of how people have evolved as caregivers over time, and that they can feel good about themselves and their life and what they do, that will teach you through role modeling of how you can find new meaning and purpose in your life. And then I think most importantly, we feel isolated and disconnected as caregivers just by being in a support group and sitting in a room with people that are going through the same thing. There's no better antidote to loneliness and isolation than sitting in a group with people and saying, wow, they know what I'm going through. They're going through the same thing. So yeah, I encourage everyone that if you've never attended a support group, that you please give it a try. It's very important.
I believe you've already answered John's question, but I'm going to ask it again. Maybe you can add a new dimension to our conversation. John asks, I know I'm supposed to take care of myself as a caregiver, but it's so hard to do that. And why do I feel so much guilt when I do something for myself?
That's one of the most common questions I encounter over the years. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of guilt associated with the grieving process. Why is that? Well, the guilt kind of represents that we're trying to understand if things could have been different, if we could have dealt with the situation differently. And a lot of people are actually dealing with this right now during the pandemic. When we're throwing curveballs in life and we don't know how to deal with the situation, and there's no examples of how to deal with it, it's easy to feel like we're never doing the right thing. And that can create a sense of guilt. But there's another reason why we feel guilt too. Many caregivers have been so self-sacrificing and are so accustomed to not taking care of themselves that self-care is a big change. And as a former therapist, I would have clients that would come in and they'd say, I'm doing what you told me to do to make changes, but it doesn't feel right. And I would say to them, well, good. That means it's changed, because if it feels right, then you're not changing. So part of why we feel guilt when we're taking care of ourselves is we're changing our behaviors. And the way the human psyche works is it tends to resist change. So you have to interpret that guilt as your psyche's way of resisting change. And here we go again. Remember I said how you need a cheerleading squad when you're dealing with family members and boundaries? Well, you need a cheerleading squad with self-care too. It's so important, because everyone that engages in self-care will have moments and say, you know, I feel really guilty when I'm out enjoying myself and I know so-and-so is back at home and they feel horrible. You need a friend to say, no, you deserve this. This is what's good for you right now. It's going to help you recharge your batteries, and you're going to be a better caregiver when you get home.
Carol has a great question here. She says, sometimes when I'm caring for my loved one, I get these overwhelming feelings of frustration. My emotions go to a bad place. What are some tools I can use to help me diffuse and deal with those negative emotions? I don't know if that would be taking a deep breath, or are there some practical quick tips that you could provide beyond the finding self-care and making time for you and cheerleading?
When you're a caregiver, whether the person's 5 months old or 95 years old, we can feel so overwhelmed with anxiety that it triggers an aggressive or an anxious response, which is biological. This is that fight or flight mechanism psychologists talk about. And the most important thing is that you need to take a break and just step away, step outside. The first thing to do when you're really feeling overwhelmed and aggressive is to get some physical distance if possible, even if it's just stepping out the front door or going in the bathroom and closing the door. And because this is a biological response to stress and feeling threatened and overwhelmed, deep breathing is very important. You know, in the 25 years I've been working in counseling and ministry, in the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of psychologists are really emphasizing the importance of deep breathing. You may want to look at resources. There's some great YouTube videos you can look at. Is what we found with deep breathing and anxiety is it actually triggers a chemical change in your body chemistry and helps the nervous system calm down. So deep breathing is important. And then talk therapy, you know, picking a phone up and calling someone and saying, so-and-so is driving me crazy. I just need to vent about this. I need to talk about it, get it out. What you don't want to do, don't bottle it up. Because, you know, there's an old saying in counseling, you can talk it out or you're going to end up acting it out. So when we talk out things, it prevents us from acting out turning negative emotions into negative behaviors that could hurt someone or hurt ourselves.
A lot of times when family members are sharing their frustration, the other family member maybe has a more deep-seated religious background and says, well, pray about it. How do those religious bases help caregivers along the way when you say about leaning on religious backgrounds?
Religion's a double-edged sword. I just preached a sermon recently for Country Meadows, and I said, I quoted a South African classmate. He said that the Bible is like a loaded gun. In the wrong hands, it can hurt a lot of people. And religion is kind of like that too. When I approach people with religion in my current role, I try to understand what their experience is, because some people have positive experiences with religion and some people don't have positive experiences. So this is a good time to reevaluate what you believe. Like, I know this whole thing, hey, you need to pray about it. That could be one of the most irritating answers anyone can give someone, right? Why is that? Well, maybe it's a complicated problem and the person needs to talk about it. So instead of listening, someone says, well, you need to pray about it. Well, it's a good time to understand what things are. So let me go over some of those tools. Prayer. What is prayer? One of the things that I talked about this past Sunday when I was preaching at a church is that the best thing about prayer is that we don't always get what we ask for in prayer, but it allows us to shift gears and to connect with the higher power, the God we believe in, and to remember that we're not alone, that we're connecting with this being that created the universe. So prayer is a way, it's sort of like meditation that helps us connect with God. Another one is spiritual writings, scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, the Christian scriptures. I was just talking to my neighbor this week about the Quran, if you're Muslim. Spiritual writings are important because they provide wisdom. They show us that people in times past have been through the same problems. They've complained about God not answering prayers. They've struggled with pain and suffering. They found hope in a difficult time. So reading religious literature, and then non-religious but spiritual literature. There's a lot of great material out there by support groups, that you can find online, and look on YouTube. I'm a big fan of YouTube. Right. If you have a topic that you're interested in, do a search on YouTube about prayer or the Bible or dealing with stress and see what you can find.
And what do you tell people who get mad at God because they aren't getting the answer they want? Their loved one is getting worse, not better. And despite all their caregiving efforts and all the sacrifices they're making, they feel like their higher power is not answering their prayer.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Remember when we talked about the grieving process, that anger is one of the dimensions of grieving? Usually it comes after denial, because we need a lot of energy to break through denial, like cracking an egg. So anger is that emotion that breaks through denial. And a normal reaction for someone when something bad happens to them that's not fair, it's normal to feel angry. And I had a friend who in the community whose daughter tragically died of cancer right before she graduated from high school. And she said, I know you're a minister. I got to ask you a question. I'm angry at God. Is that bad? And I said, no, don't feel guilty about it. You're going to have to get in line because there's about 3 billion people on this planet that are angry at God right now, right? Because bad things happen to good people. Suffering happens in life. And God knows that. And, think of God in this way. For those of you that are parents or grandparents or own pets, right? You ever do something that makes the other party angry? Yeah, of course. And you love them. And you can look at your pet or look at your child or your grandchild and say, you know what? It's okay for you to be angry. I know you think it's wrong, but I still love you. And that's just the way it is. Well, God's like that. Yeah, of course we're angry at him when bad things happen in life's unfair, but he loves us and he knows that's part of the way we're dealing with the situation. And if you talk to people, ministers, religious people, to say you're not allowed to be angry at God, run away from them as quickly as possible. Because if you look at the Old Testament and the Hebrew scriptures, there are tons of parts of the Old Testament where people are angry at God. And what happens? They hang in there. God understands. They work through the anger, and eventually they come to a new level of acceptance, and their faith becomes stronger. So being angry at God is actually a healthy sign you're working through your faith. You just don't want to get stuck in the anger.
Thank you. Great advice. I know I've been saying that to every answer you're giving, but you're providing a wealth of knowledge and information for our caregivers. Anything you would like to share before we conclude the webinar?
I'd like to share with one of my favorite slogans that I've heard in support groups over the years, and that is this: we can do things together that we could never do alone. And that's my big thing. I want, and whoever's listening to this, I want you to take away from this: we can do things together that we could never do alone. And for all of you that are listening right now, we were never meant to deal with caregiving all by ourselves. We need the support to take care of ourselves. And when we have that support, even though it's very difficult, it's going to be good for you, and it's going to be good for the person you're taking care of. Caregiving is a team sport. It's not an individual sport. So please reach out, get support, and talk to people that you know. Look into an Alzheimer's support group, but don't do it alone. Okay, that's my final thought.
Thank you so much to the Reverend Howard West for sharing advice, guidelines, as well as practical tips and tools all of us caregivers can use as we're navigating our caregiving journey. Do you have additional questions that we did not address in this webinar? Well, this does not have to be the end of your caregiving journey. Simply email your questions to us at asktheexperts@countrymeadows.com or asktheexperts@ecumenicalretirement.org. To our viewers, thank you for joining us. And remember, we're here to help. We're here to help you. Make it a great day.